Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a world of silk veils, stone chambers, and quiet dread. A world where royal daughters are groomed not for love, but for loyalty, where a wedding is less about romance and more about politics, borders, and survival. This is the life of a medieval royal bride. Not the fairy tale princess with roses in her hair, but the girl who's shipped off before her first period, married to a man twice her age, and expected to bear heirs before she knows her own body. Some never even made it to the altar. So, before you get cozy under that warm blanket, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if what I do here genuinely helps you wind down at night. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? There's something oddly soothing about knowing there are others awake with us, wandering through history together. Now, dim the lights, light a candle if you have one, or just let the soft glow of your screen draw you deeper. Close your eyes, and slowly let the noise of today fade into silence as we drift back in time, not to a fairy tale castle, but to a stone hall lit by smoky torches, where the air smells of wax, sweat, and wool. The year is 732. A nobleman paces the floor while servants whisper behind tapestries. A little girl, barely 7 years old, sits quietly in a heavy woolen gown, her legs dangling from a wooden bench, too tall for her feet to touch the floor. She does not understand Latin, nor does she recognize the crest stitched into the wax seal. But by sunrise, her fate will be sealed. She is to be married, not next year, not when she's old enough to speak for herself, but now, in writing, between two men who've never once asked her what she wants. This was how royal marriage worked in the early Middle Ages. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even always about heirs. At its heart, marriage among kings and nobles was war by other means, a contract signed in flesh and sealed with blood. And the blood often belonged to the bride. In these early centuries, from the fall of Rome to the days of Charlemagne and beyond, political power was fragile. Kingdoms rose and fell by inheritance, betrayal, and marriage. A daughter wasn't just a child. She was a living treaty, a walking bribe, a way to buy peace or steal territory without drawing a sword. And in that system, royal girls were often promised in marriage before they could walk. One of the earliest recorded examples comes from the 7th century. A Frankish king arranged for his infant daughter to be betrothed to the son of a rival. The children were both under 5. The wedding wouldn't happen for years, but the contract was already binding. If either side broke it, war would follow. These marriages were public affairs, often celebrated by entire kingdoms, but they weren't happy. They were tense negotiations in churches and courts, where the bride's future rested on the whims of men with knives tucked under their robes. Even when the bride reached marrying age, the danger wasn't over. In fact, it often began in earnest on the wedding night. Girls as young as 12 were expected to produce heirs, and childbirth in the early Middle Ages was brutally dangerous. Without sanitation, anesthesia, or understanding of infection, giving birth was one of the leading causes of death for women, especially for young brides whose bodies had barely begun to mature. Historians believe that many royal brides died in their teens from complications of early childbirth. We know of one Merovingian princess who died during her first pregnancy at age 14. Her name has been lost to time, replaced in records only by the alliance she represented and the land she helped secure. The groom survived. He remarried within a year. Even when they survived childbirth, royal brides faced other threats. Court life was a minefield. A young bride from a foreign land often arrived without allies, unfamiliar with the customs and surrounded by rival claimants who saw her as a threat. Jealous stepmothers, ambitious brothers-in-law, or angry courtiers could poison her meals, undermine her reputation, or orchestrate her exile. And if her husband died without an heir, she might be sent to a convent, or worse, accused of witchcraft or treason. Some queens didn't even make it to the altar. Travel was dangerous. Roads were muddy, narrow, and filled with thieves. Brides were expected to cross hundreds of miles on horseback or in carriages, sometimes in winter, to reach their groom's court. One Frankish princess, en route to her wedding in Lombardy, died of exposure after her carriage overturned in a river. Her death ended the alliance. The groom married someone else. Then there were the cases where marriage was little more than a trap. Powerful kings sometimes used marriage as a pretext for conquest. A lesser noble might be offered the hand of a royal daughter, only to be invaded once he accepted. The marriage wasn't a gift. It was a warning. Take our daughter and let us in. Refuse, and we'll come anyway, with swords drawn. There is also the strange case of women who were promised but never married. Some were imprisoned in nunneries to prevent rival claims. Others were quietly murdered before the wedding night could even take place. In one chilling case from the early 800s, a Carolingian princess disappeared from the court days before her arranged wedding. The official explanation was illness, but no burial was ever recorded. Her groom received a different bride within weeks. Behind every royal wedding was a story not of celebration, but of calculation. These marriages were tools, weapons, sacrifices, and the brides, often girls, often voiceless, were the first to suffer when politics turned violent. What makes all of this even more haunting is that many of these women are now nameless. They appear in chronicles as the daughter of such and such, or the wife of the king. Their real stories, what they felt, what they feared, are gone. All that remains are glimpses, a dowry listed in parchment ink, a funeral recorded in a bishop's diary, a note from a scribe that the girl did not survive the year. And yet their influence was vast. Wars were fought over them. Borders were drawn because of them. Dynasties rose and fell based on whether or not they gave birth to a boy before dying. This was the bride price of blood, paid not in gold, but in the quiet, slow erasure of lives offered up for the sake of power. Tonight, as you fall asleep, remember them, not as princesses in towers, but as the forgotten pawns in a game they never chose to play. Now let's talk about one of these brides named Elfgifu. Her name meant gift of the elves, a name both soft and sacred in the tongue of the Anglo-Saxons. But no name, no matter how lyrical, could protect a girl from politics. She was born around the year 975 into a world still reeling from the raids of Norsemen, the scheming of rival earls, and the quiet, calculating ambitions of kings. Elfgifu's birth was not celebrated with much fanfare. Her existence would only begin to matter once she could be married off. She was the daughter of a minor ealdorman in southern England, a man with more land than power and more debts than allies. But he had something other nobles wanted: blood ties to the old royal line of Wessex. That made Ælfgifu valuable, not because of her smile or her mind, but because her womb carried the possibility of a legitimate heir. And when an offer came from the north, a powerful lord near Northumbria, her fate was sealed. She was likely around 13 or 14, the age when many noble girls were considered ready for marriage, though not truly ready for the life that followed. The groom was older, a warrior lord hardened by border conflicts and clan disputes. He had no wife, and more importantly, no heir. A southern bride would be a sign of peace between their regions. It would show that he had the blessing of the southern court, perhaps even the king's favor. But peace bought this way rarely lasted. It hung on a thread, and that thread was Ælfgifu. There is no portrait of her, no confirmed depiction in any tapestry or manuscript, but chroniclers did mention her briefly, a noble daughter married for unity, gone before her time. Her arrival in the north was likely cold, in every sense. She would have been greeted by unfamiliar customs, harsh weather, and a court that didn't quite trust her. Foreign brides were always watched closely for signs of weakness or ambition. A single wrong word, a misunderstood custom, could spark resentment, or worse, suspicion. What we know from monastic records is this: Ælfgifu was married, celebrated, and then, within a year, dead. The official explanation given at the time was illness, a wasting fever, as one monk phrased it, though no further detail was recorded. But the speed of her decline raised questions even among the clergy. She'd arrived in good health, young and strong. No outbreak was reported in her household. No other members of the court fell ill. And yet she died, suddenly, quietly, and with no child to carry on her name or her bloodline. Was it truly disease? Or something darker? The early medieval world was no stranger to poison. Subtle, silent, and hard to trace, it was the perfect weapon in a world without autopsies. Bitter herbs, powdered metals, even certain fungi, all could be slipped into wine or stew. Some killed quickly, others over weeks, producing symptoms that mimicked common fevers or consumption. And foreign brides like Ælfgifu were especially vulnerable. They ate what others prepared. They drank what was offered. They had no allies, no protectors beyond their husbands. And sometimes, even that bond was thin. There were rumors, of course. Whispers in court that she had offended the local priest, that she had brought a relic south and refused to part with it, that she had been too kind to a servant girl who had once been punished for theft. None of these seem like reasons to kill a queen-in-waiting, but in the tangled webs of Anglo-Saxon politics, even small gestures could be interpreted as disloyalty. And if the northern lord had changed his mind, if he wanted a new alliance, a different bride, it would have been simpler to make Ælfgifu disappear than to suffer the embarrassment of annulment. Another possibility lies with her own family. If the southern court had feared that Ælfgifu was becoming too influential, or suspected she might tip the balance of northern power, there were darker hands in the south who may have preferred her gone. Her death, while tragic, cleared the way for new negotiations. Within a year of her passing, her former husband remarried, this time to a Mercian noblewoman with ties to the church. The alliance shifted. The power map redrew itself, and Elfgifu became a footnote. We don't know where she was buried. Perhaps in a small monastery graveyard, perhaps in the family crypt of her husband, though her name was never etched into the records there. Some historians believe she may have been buried in unconsecrated ground, a quiet disgrace for reasons lost to time. Others suggest her body was returned south in secret, shipped by river or cart, wrapped in wool under guard to avoid scandal. Either way, there was no mourning parade, no lasting memorial, no prayers sung for her soul in yearly remembrance. She vanished from the chronicles almost as quickly as she had entered them. But even in death, Elfgifu served a purpose. Her passing allowed for new deals, new marriages, new power plays. Her short life, barely a flicker, was enough to tip the scales in a region long plagued by instability. And that, in the cold eyes of kings and courtiers, was enough. The tragedy of Elfgifu is not just in her early death, but in the silence that followed. She likely left no writings, no children, no living witnesses loyal enough to keep her story alive. But every once in a while, her name reappears in a bishop's letter, in a scribbled marginal note, in a monk's bitter warning about the dangers of courtly life. And through those scraps, we can piece together the outline of a life shaped, steered, and sacrificed by power. Tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, remember her, not as a queen or a saint or a martyr, but as a girl who once stood between two worlds, caught in the quiet storm of politics she never asked to join. Her breath, her blood, her name, all offered in service to men who saw her as nothing more than a seal on a scroll. In the long, dim corridors of royal history, hers is the kind of death that echoes, not with fanfare, but with a question. What was her life worth, if even her death was only part of the deal? Now, let's talk about the mysterious death of Gisela, daughter of Charlemagne. She was born into an empire that spanned mountains, rivers, and centuries of ambition. Gisela, daughter of Charlemagne, came into the world not as a child, but as a symbol. Her very existence was strategic, her cradle positioned closer to the throne than any dollhouse. In a royal court where daughters were weighed as assets, Gisela stood out, not only for her lineage, but for the mysterious silence that came to surround her. Charlemagne, Charles the Great, was not just king of the Franks. By the late 8th century, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans, reviving an imperial legacy that hadn't existed in the West for centuries. He had sons for generals, bishops, and co-rulers. His daughters, however, were destined for one thing: alliances. Each match had to count. Every marriage proposal had to tilt the map of Europe just slightly in his favor. But Gisela? Her path never quite followed the plan. We don't know exactly what year she was born. Some place her arrival around 781, others slightly later. But we do know that she grew up in a palace alive with chanting clerics, armored knights, and advisors whispering behind tapestries. Her education would have been exceptional: reading, Latin, religious instruction. Charlemagne insisted on learned children, and yet, despite being the daughter of the most powerful man in Western Europe, Gisela never married. That wasn't for lack of opportunity. Her name appears several times in diplomatic correspondence, each time attached to a potential match. A Lombard prince, a Breton noble, even an ambassador from the Byzantine Empire once raised the idea. But each time, the proposal collapsed, quietly, awkwardly, and without explanation. At first, her unmarried status was seen as temporary. Perhaps her father was negotiating for something greater, a future match with a rival empire that needed careful timing. But as the years passed, the absence became impossible to ignore. There was a problem, and the court knew it. Some chroniclers suggest that Charlemagne himself refused to allow his daughters to marry at all. He was notoriously protective, keeping them close, perhaps fearing what might happen if a son-in-law used his daughter's status to launch a bid for power. But this doesn't fully explain the case of Gisela, who by all accounts was raised with the expectation of being a queen. She wasn't cloistered like some noble girls. She was present at court, involved in ceremony, and spoken of in political terms. Something had changed, and that change was swift. One theory, whispered by later historians, suggests Gisela became inconvenient. Perhaps she knew too much. Perhaps she had been involved, willingly or not, in the darker intrigues of court life. A secret affair, a failed betrothal that ended in insult, or even the discovery of internal betrayal. In those days, royal women were both witnesses and pawns. To be privy to sensitive knowledge without the right protections was to carry a death sentence disguised as illness. And then there is the matter of her death. Gisela disappears from the records abruptly. No grand funeral is described, no mourning period declared by the court, no shrine or commemorative statue raised in her honor. For a woman of her status, this absence is deafening. Some texts suggest she died young, possibly in her early 20s. Others push her lifespan further, suggesting she lived into her 30s, still unmarried, still curiously isolated. The cause? Never confirmed. One monk, writing years after the fact, mentions a sudden and humbling decline in her health, but provides no further detail. Another simply notes her passing before she fulfilled her duty to the realm. A delicate phrase that says everything and nothing. But in the imperial court of Charlemagne, death rarely came without design. It was a time of subtle murders, quiet poisonings in ivory chalices, fatal fevers after midday stews, sudden accidents on hunting trips. If Gisela had angered someone powerful, she might have simply faded away, her passing smoothed over by scribes who were instructed not to draw attention. Or worse, she may have been buried in secret, her body denied the rites that would ensure her memory lived on in prayers and parchment. What would warrant such treatment? Perhaps she resisted a proposed marriage, embarrassed a potential ally, or was caught in correspondence with the wrong faction. Or perhaps her death was a preventative measure, an answer to a question no one dared ask aloud. After all, her unmarried status was unusual. If she had taken a lover, even discreetly, it could have triggered a scandal large enough to endanger treaties. Royal bloodlines had to remain unquestioned, especially for daughters who might bear future heirs. A pregnancy without paperwork was a disaster. Yet not all theories point to intrigue. Some suggest Gisela may have fallen victim to the same fate as so many medieval women: childbirth. If she had conceived in secret, whether by love, coercion, or political miscalculation, she may have died in labor, her body and her mistake both quietly removed from history. No midwife would speak, no priest would record her confession, and no father, not even Charlemagne, would want the shame of a royal bastard to blot the empire's future. Whatever the truth, it never made it to the official chronicles. Gisella's name fades into shadow, buried not just beneath stone, but beneath centuries of silence. Her sisters, too, suffered similar erasures. Charlemagne's daughters were educated, honored, and protected, until they weren't. Until the moment they became liabilities. And then, like Gisela, they disappeared. To this day, no grave has been definitively linked to her. No relic, no preserved correspondence, just a few scattered lines in medieval texts and the quiet certainty that something, someone, was silenced. In the court of Charlemagne, greatness came with a cost, and for some, the highest price was invisibility. So tonight, as you lie in the soft hush of your own room, think of Gisela, not the myth, not the symbol, but the woman, a daughter born into brilliance, a bride who never was, a name nearly lost. Her life may have ended without ceremony, but the echoes remain. In the blank spaces of royal documents, in the suspicious silences of court records, and in the cold, quiet reminder that even imperial daughters could vanish without a trace when power decided they no longer mattered. Sleep now. But remember, sometimes the most haunting stories aren't found in blood-soaked battlefields or dark castles. Sometimes they hide in the lines no one ever finished writing. For now, let me tell the story of the tragic betrothal of Princess Estrid. She was born into blood and salt, Danish royalty, Viking legacy. Estrid Svensdatter came into the world with power behind her and the weight of a kingdom stitched into the hems of her gowns. Daughter of King Swine Forkbeard and sister to King Knut the Great, she was meant to be a bridge between kingdoms, a golden key to seal alliances in a time when peace was a gamble and marriage could cost your life. But Estrid's path through history was anything but smooth. Her name would appear in chronicles across Scandinavia and England, each time tethered to a different man, a different betrothal, a different tragedy. And although she would survive into old age, a rare feat for a woman of her time, none of her husbands would live to see their twilight. Some say her heart was cursed. Others say her womb bore only grief. But all agree. Princess Estrid brought death to every altar. Her first known betrothal was to be a grand union, strategic, imperial, and deeply unfortunate. Around the turn of the millennium, she was promised to Robert, son of Richard II, Duke of Normandy. This was no simple courtly romance. Normandy was rising, a powerful coastal duchy with Viking blood of its own, and a marriage between a Danish princess and the Norman heir could unite warlords and kings under a single banner. For a moment it seemed Estrid's marriage would bind the Channel and the North Sea into a single royal pond. But the marriage never happened. Robert died, suddenly, mysteriously, before the wedding was finalized. Some claimed it was illness, others whispered assassination. The exact cause vanished into the mists of history. But one fact remains. Estrid never crossed the sea to Normandy. Her groom, like so many who would follow, perished before she even lit the wedding torches. Undeterred, her father and brother tried again. She was too valuable to leave unmarried, and the game of European alliances never stopped turning. This time, Estrid was betrothed to a man named Ulf Jarl, a powerful Danish noble with ambitions as sharp as his axe. He was no foreign prince, but a man of local influence and battlefield prestige. The marriage went through. Finally, Estrid was a wife. But her troubles had only begun. Ulf was clever, too clever. He rose quickly in the court of King Canute, Estrid's brother, and began to test the limits of his station. Some said he whispered treason. Others claimed he tried to carve out his own realm. Whether out of ambition or fear, Nut ordered Ulf's assassination. He was killed in a church, reportedly during Christmas services, cut down by men loyal to the king, Estrid's brother. Imagine the silence of that palace, a wife widowed by her own kin, a princess torn between royal duty and personal loss. Whatever grief Estrid carried, she buried it beneath protocol and prayer. She remained at court, her political value intact, but her heart hollowed. 2 men gone, 1 marriage never born, 1 husband murdered at an altar. But still, her story didn't end. Estrid was considered for marriage again, this time to Edward the Confessor. Yes, that Edward, the future Saint King of England. The match made sense on paper. Edward had spent years in exile in Normandy and needed allies to reclaim his English throne. Estrid, with her Danish blood and royal connections, could help stabilize the rocky relationship between England and Denmark. Once again, negotiations began. Once again, plans were made. But once again, death and ambition intervened. This match, too, collapsed. Edward ultimately married Edith of Wessex instead, a choice that would shape the destiny of England and its eventual conquest by the Normans. Estrid, meanwhile, was left to watch another crown slip through her fingers. Whether this particular betrothal failed due to politics or personal rejection, we may never know. But for Estrid, it was just another chapter in a life marked by near marriages and very real deaths. By the end of her middle years, Estrid had become something more than a princess. She was a survivor in a court of ghosts. Her husband had been killed. Her proposed grooms had died or disappeared. She'd watched thrones shift, alliances collapse, and kingdoms drown in blood. And still, she lived. In time, she would gain the unusual title of queen, though she was never crowned alongside a reigning king. Some historians believe this was an honorary title granted late in life, a gesture of respect for her endurance and legacy. Others say she ruled in her own right, a matriarch of the Danish court, influential behind the scenes in ways that scribes chose not to record. She also became one of the earliest known patrons of the church in Denmark, endowing religious foundations and securing prayers for her soul and the souls of those who had gone before her, husbands, brothers, sons. Her faith, it seems, was the one relationship that did not end in betrayal or death. So why did so many men around her die? It wasn't Estrid's fault, not truly. She was a woman of her time, handed from court to court, her body and name traded like coin. But it's hard to ignore the pattern. Betrothed men died. Husbands were murdered. Political arrangements surrounding her unraveled. Whether by poison, blade, or fate, Estrid seemed to carry something dangerous into every proposed union. Some whispered it was a curse. Others said she was simply born into a time when marriage was another name for war. And in a way, they're right. Because in the Viking world, marriage wasn't about love. It was a blood pact, a strategy, a gamble with lives on the table. And Estrid, for all her silk and ceremony, played the game with the highest stakes. Her life is a reminder that behind every royal wedding were spies, enemies, and secrets buried deeper than any dowry. She lived longer than most of her kin, died peacefully, it seems, in old age. A rare thing. She saw sons become kings, churches rise in her name, and dynasties shift around the blood she carried. But she also bore the memories of grooms who never lived to be husbands, of rings that never reached her finger, and of weddings that ended in tombs instead of toasts. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think of Estrid, daughter of conquerors, bride to none, and survivor of 100 broken promises. Her story isn't loud. It doesn't come with grand battles or famous speeches. It comes with silence, shadows, and a pattern of missing men. Because sometimes, the most haunting tales are the ones where nothing quite happens the way it should, and yet everything changes because of it. Now let's talk about the deadly wedding of Urraca of Leon. In the winding, sun-drenched halls of medieval Leon, a city nestled between the rugged mountains and rolling plains of northern Spain, the tale of Urraca unfolds. A tale not of triumphant romance or glittering crowns, but of deadly politics sealed with a dowry paid in blood. Urraca was no ordinary princess. She was the daughter of King Alfonso V of Leon, born into a turbulent era where kingdoms clashed, alliances shifted like desert sands, and the promise of peace was as fragile as a spider's web. Born around 1033, Urraca was a royal jewel whose value was measured less by her own desires and more by the alliances she could forge. As the eldest surviving daughter, her hand in marriage was a powerful bargaining chip. It was customary for medieval royal brides to bring not only their family's honor, but also wealth and land, dowries that could reshape borders and tip the scales of power. But in Urraca's case, that dowry would prove more curse than blessing. The story begins with Urraca's father, Alfonso V, whose reign was marked by attempts to unify the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain against the advancing Moors to the south. Marriages were a favored weapon in his arsenal, a way to bind rival factions without spilling more blood on the battlefield. Around 1050, negotiations began to marry Urraca to Raymond of Burgundy, a nobleman from across the Pyrenees, part of the growing wave of French knights and lords invited into the Iberian Peninsula. This alliance promised military strength and fresh blood to the Leonese court. But the union was fraught from the start. Urraca and Raymond were strangers thrust together by political necessity, their personal feelings irrelevant to the greater game. More importantly, the marriage involved not just the couple, but an intricate dance of land, titles, and loyalties. The dowry included vast estates and control over key fortresses, real assets that could shift power balances dramatically. Wedding day arrived, a grand spectacle of banners, feasts, and ceremonies. Yet beneath the grandeur, a darker tension simmered. Local nobles, jealous of the growing influence of the Burgundians, whispered threats and plotted intrigues. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, the kind that could poison both wine and hearts. After the ceremony, the newlyweds retreated to their chambers, where tradition held that consummation would seal their bond. But for Urraca, this night would be her last. Historical records are frustratingly vague about the exact circumstances of what happened next, but enough clues survive to hint at tragedy. Shortly after the wedding, Urraca fell gravely ill. Some chroniclers speak of a sudden fever. Others mention poisoned wine or a curse from jealous enemies. Her death was swift, shocking the court and sending ripples through the fragile alliance. The dowry she brought remained, but the bride herself was gone. An empty promise shadowed by loss. Why did Urraca die? Was it a natural illness? Or something far more sinister? The truth remains elusive, but context offers grim possibilities. Medieval courts were breeding grounds for treachery. Poisoning was a common tool, hard to detect, easy to administer. The dowry's value made Urraca a target, removing her cleared obstacles for rival factions hungry to control her lands. Her husband Raymond would later wield the dowry's power to establish himself firmly in Leon, but not without suspicion falling on those close to the bride. Complicating matters, the physical dangers of childbirth loomed large over all royal brides. Though Urraca had barely begun her new life, many noblewomen died from complications during or shortly after their first pregnancies. Without modern medicine, a fever could quickly turn fatal, and no court physician could reliably diagnose or treat infections. Yet Urraca's illness reportedly began before any child was born, raising questions about whether her death was caused by foul play rather than nature. Beyond the personal tragedy, Urraca's demise highlights the brutal reality of medieval royal marriages, where brides were often little more than political pawns, their lives and bodies leveraged for power, territory, and legacy. In a world without divorce or simple annulment, death sometimes became the grim solution to inconvenient alliances. Urraca's death triggered a cascade of consequences. The Burgundian influence in Leon grew, setting the stage for future power struggles and wars. Her absence left a vacuum that other factions rushed to fill, and her family mourned not only a daughter, but a fragile peace. Yet her story was not forgotten. Chroniclers recorded the sorrow and scandal, preserving her name in the annals of Spanish history as a cautionary tale of alliance and ambition. Later, queens would face similar fates, their own lives and deaths shaped by the deadly politics that surrounded them. Tonight, as the quiet darkness surrounds you, think of Urraca, caught between duty and danger, a princess whose wedding night became a tomb, whose dowry was more a curse than a gift. Her story reminds us that behind every royal marriage lies a web of power struggles, risks, and sacrifices, often hidden beneath the glitter of gold and silk. Let her story settle gently in your mind as you drift toward sleep. A reminder that history's most beautiful promises sometimes come with the bitterest costs. Now, let me tell the story of Matilda of Scotland's first failed marriage. Long before she ever wore a crown or bore the name Good Queen Maud, Matilda of Scotland was a girl between two worlds, born of royal blood, raised among nuns, and quietly waiting for her destiny to call her forward. And yet, for a time, her path to queenship was not only uncertain, but nearly extinguished by a death no one truly explained. She was born around 1080 in the stormy aftermath of the Norman conquest, to Malcolm III of Scotland and Saint Margaret of Wessex, a rare pairing that united Celtic chieftain lines with the fading Anglo-Saxon royalty of pre-Norman England. From the beginning, her very name carried significance. She was christened Edith, a nod to her mother's English roots and a signal to future suitors that she was a valuable political pawn, English enough to appeal to Saxon loyalists, and noble enough to sit beside a king. Her early childhood was steeped in both piety and politics. When she was just a child, her parents sent her to the Abbey of Romsey in England, where her Aunt Christina was abbess. There, surrounded by veiled women and candlelit prayers, Edith received not only an education, but something closer to seclusion. And yet, despite the habits and the hymns, she never took full vows. She remained technically free to marry, a loophole that would become crucial in the years ahead. But first came the match that few remember, her first betrothal. The man's name was Rotrou III, Count of Perche, a noble of moderate standing in northern France with close ties to the royal court. At first glance, he may not have seemed a kingmaker, but in the early 12th century, politics were fluid, and alliances were often forged not by crowns, but by calculated marriages. Rotrou was young, ambitious, and eager to strengthen his position. And Matilda, though cloistered, was a catch. Not only was she the daughter of a king, she was also connected to the Old English ruling line, a link still seen as legitimate by many in the country who resisted Norman rule. But the engagement was short-lived, very short. Within months, possibly even weeks, of the arrangement being formalized, Rotrou was dead. The cause? Unclear. Contemporaries offer little explanation. One chronicle claims he was taken by a sudden illness, a vague phrase often used to smooth over the messier realities of medieval death. Others offer no details at all, as though the betrothal had been a rumor or a plan best forgotten. But the silence itself is telling. For a man of Rotrou's standing, to die so abruptly, after securing such a politically valuable bride, raises questions. There are whispers, just whispers, that his death may have been no accident. Perhaps rival nobles feared the union would shift the balance of power. Perhaps Norman loyalists sought to prevent an Anglo-Saxon resurgence through Edith's marriage. Or perhaps it was something more intimate, a private betrayal, an affair, or an insult that spiraled into fatal consequence. In the courts of the Middle Ages, poison was always cheaper than a war. Whatever the truth, Rotrou was buried, Edith was unwed, and her future was suspended in the sort of limbo that could last a lifetime. Now technically unmarriageable, but not fully a nun, Edith lingered in the abbey system for several more years. Some claimed she had indeed taken holy vows and was no longer eligible for matrimony. Others, including Edith herself, refuted the claim fiercely. In one famous moment years later, she reportedly tore her veil in front of a bishop, declaring she had worn it only under her aunt's command, and never with the intent of becoming a bride of Christ. She was not meant for God's altar, she insisted. She was meant for a throne. That throne came in the form of Henry I of England, fourth son of William the Conqueror, and a man with more ambition than inheritance. When his brother, King William II, died suddenly in a mysterious hunting accident in 1100, Henry seized the throne and knew immediately that he needed a wife to solidify his reign. And not just any wife. He needed someone with Anglo-Saxon blood to calm the fractious English nobility, still angry about Norman rule, decades after Hastings. Edith was the perfect choice. She had royal blood on both sides. She was intelligent, educated, fluent in multiple languages, and, most importantly, untainted by scandal, despite the strange shadows cast by her first failed match. But there was a hitch, the controversy over her time in the convent. Some bishops resisted the union on religious grounds. Was she truly free to marry? Had she made vows she was now breaking? Henry, never a man to be slowed by technicalities, bulldozed through the opposition. Edith changed her name to Matilda, a more queenly name associated with the Norman dynasty, and was crowned shortly after their marriage. With that act, she stepped fully into the role she had long been denied, Queen Consort of England. She would go on to play a crucial part in Henry's reign, supporting religious reform, interceding on behalf of the poor, and navigating the treacherous waters of Anglo-Norman politics. She bore 2 children, including a daughter also named Matilda, who would later become Empress of the Holy Roman Empire and spark a civil war over her claim to the English throne. And yet, for all her later power, the death of Rotrou, the ghost of her first engagement, never quite left the margins of her story. What might her life have looked like had he lived? Would she have remained in France, a countess far from the English court? Would she have faded into history like so many noble women of modest rank? Or would the political tides have swept her toward greatness regardless, her royal blood too valuable to remain cloistered forever? We can't know. The only certainty is that the path to Matilda's queenship was shaped not only by ambition and strategy, but by an early and unexplained death that changed everything. So tonight, as the modern world hums quietly around you, remember the girl behind the crown. Not just the queen history praises, but the bride who never was, the one who waited behind abbey walls, nearly erased, before she ever stepped onto the stage. In a world where royal weddings shaped empires, even a canceled engagement could echo for centuries. Sleep well. The past is full of untold beginnings and unfinished endings. Now let me tell the tale of a Norman bride's curse. In the shadow of conquest, not every victory ends with a crown. Some stories curl inward, quietly tragic, tucked behind the thunder of war drums and the glory of empire. Adela of Normandy was born into one of the most powerful families in medieval Europe, daughter of William the Conqueror, sister to kings, duchess in her own right. But power, as always, comes with a price. And for Adela, that price was paid in the currency of death, disappointment, and near-forgotten sorrow. She was born around 1067, just after her father's triumph at the Battle of Hastings. While England reeled from invasion, William's children were already being groomed for rule. His sons would inherit lands soaked in blood. His daughters would be offered as tokens of peace, alliance, or submission, whichever suited the court that year. Adela was no exception. From the moment she could speak, her future was not her own. As a daughter of the newly crowned King of England and Duke of Normandy, she was a walking treaty. Her name carried weight across both the Channel and the continent. And while she was known for her intellect and piety, traits not often preserved about women of her time, it was her marital potential that most intrigued Europe's nobility. By the age of 10, negotiations for Adela's first betrothal had already begun. One proposed match was with Harold, the eldest son of Sweyn II of Denmark, another with the heir of the Count of Flanders. These negotiations were not simple family conversations. They were diplomatic chess moves, calculated to keep alliances in balance and enemies at bay. But something always went wrong. One of the earliest candidates, whose name has been lost in the fog of poorly kept records, died before the wedding. The official cause? A hunting accident. He was thrown from his horse the day before the ceremony. His neck snapped on a rock in what some described as a freak fall. But others whispered differently, that perhaps the match had grown politically risky, that perhaps someone, rival court, angry cousin, or even an overprotective father, had intervened before the wedding sealed the bond. There were too many accidents surrounding Adela's engagements to be coincidence. A second suitor, a nobleman from the Low Countries, fell ill shortly after visiting Normandy. He died of fever and swelling, and while disease was common, some noted the timing. Just weeks after William had publicly praised the match, that marriage, too, never came to pass. For a time, Adela's name became a cautionary tale in royal courts, beautiful, clever, pious, and cursed. It's not hard to imagine what such a reputation would do to a young woman of high birth. In a world where her worth was measured in bloodlines and alliances, a cursed bride had no value. Yet somehow, Adela endured. She survived the deaths, the rumors, the betrayals, and she did eventually marry. But even that, in its own way, was less triumph than transaction. Her husband was Stephen of Blois, a nobleman of considerable wealth and title, but still considered beneath the daughter of a king. Their marriage was arranged quickly, some say hastily, after another political opportunity collapsed. There were no grand feasts or ballads sung for this union. It was practical, quiet, perhaps even desperate. But here is where the story takes its strangest turn. Despite her cursed reputation, Adela proved an extraordinarily capable wife. She bore at least 10 children, among them Stephen of Blois, who would one day claim the throne of England during the anarchy that followed King Henry's death. She managed estates, oversaw charitable works, and even served as regent while her husband left for the First Crusade. At times, Adela effectively ruled in his absence, signing charters and managing the affairs of Blois with a sharp and steady hand. She was no longer the unlucky girl of suspicious betrothals. She was a duchess, a matriarch, a politician in all but name. And yet, even as she stepped into authority, the specter of her early life never entirely vanished. The court still murmured of the deaths that had followed her, of the curse that had hovered over her youth, of how many men had tried to claim her, and how few had lived to tell the tale. In her later years, Adela retreated into religious life, eventually taking the veil and entering a convent. To some, this was a noble step, a woman of piety ending her life in quiet contemplation. To others, it was one final escape. From politics, from motherhood, from memory. She died in 1137, far from the blood-soaked chaos of her father's reign and her son's civil war. Unlike many royal women, Adela died not in childbirth, not from disease, not from a political assassination. She died quietly, peacefully, perhaps finally free from the strange, tragic pattern that had followed her since childhood. History has not been kind to Adela. While her brothers are remembered in battles and titles, Robert, the Crusader, William Rufus, the red-haired king felled by an arrow, Henry, the scholar king who seized the crown, Adela remains a footnote, a daughter of, a mother of, never the subject, always the context. But look closer, and you'll see something else. Resilience. This was a woman who was nearly married off to corpses, who endured the deaths of more than one betrothed, who married beneath her station, ran an estate, raised a king, and retired into faith, not from failure, but from exhaustion. Her life was not grand, but it was long, filled with moments of quiet power and stubborn survival. And in the cold light of medieval history, that's no small thing. So tonight, as the world quiets around you, spare a moment for Adela. Not for the bride she was supposed to be, nor the duchess she became, but for the girl who watched her future fall apart, again and again, and somehow stood up every time, ready to be written back into a story that never seemed to want her. Not every crown shines. Not every bride wears white. And not every legend ends in glory. Some simply endure. Now let's talk about Constance of Sicily. In the long corridors of medieval history, few royal women have endured as much suspicion, sacrifice, and symbolic burden as Constance of Sicily. Her life, delayed, disrupted, and nearly destroyed, offers a haunting example of how a single woman's body could carry the weight of an empire. Born a princess but kept from marriage until most would have long since faded from political favor, Constance became the pawn in a dangerous game between popes, emperors, and kings. And yet, despite nearly dying before she could even say her vows, it was after her wedding that her real torment began. Constance entered the world in 1154, the daughter of Roger II, King of Sicily. She was born into a kingdom unlike any other in Europe at the time, a wealthy, culturally blended land where Norman knights, Arabic scholars, and Greek clerics walked the same palace halls. But even with this richness, Constance's early life was curiously quiet. She wasn't married off as a child, nor betrothed in infancy like so many royal girls. In fact, by the time she reached her 30s, a near anomaly for a medieval princess, she remained unmarried. There were whispers. Some said she had been hidden away in a convent, not by choice, but by decree. Others claimed she had taken religious vows, though this was likely a political story designed to explain her absence from the marriage market. Whatever the truth, Constance was shelved, until she wasn't. When Sicily needed her, she was suddenly, fatefully recalled. In the 1180s, her cousin, King William II of Sicily, found himself heirless and desperate. With no direct successor, the crown would be vulnerable after his death. To prevent chaos, he named Constance as his heiress, a rare move in a male-dominated world. But just naming her wasn't enough. She had to be married. She had to be secured. And so, at the improbable age of 30-something, Constance of Sicily was plucked from her obscurity and placed at the center of European power. Her intended groom? Henry VI, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, and future emperor himself. The union would be grand, Sicily and the empire united. But grandness often comes soaked in danger. The journey north to marry Henry was not the romantic procession of storybooks. As Constance traveled through the Italian peninsula, violence flared. Bandits, rebels, and factions loyal to other claimants to the Sicilian throne saw her passage as a threat. At one point, she was nearly captured. Her convoy was forced to divert through treacherous terrain. Illness took hold among her attendants. According to later accounts, Constance herself fell gravely ill, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from poison. And yet, she survived. In 1186, in the city of Milan, Constance finally married Henry VI. The ceremony was lavish and the political theater complete, but the story didn't end there. It barely began. As the new empress, Constance now carried two crowns, one of Sicily and one of the Holy Roman Empire. But she was not welcomed with open arms. Northern Italians and German nobles viewed her as foreign. Sicilian elites distrusted her for marrying into the imperial enemy. And Henry? Henry viewed her less as a wife and more as an instrument of legitimacy. Within just a few years of marriage, Constance found herself a prisoner, not of war, but of her own in-laws. After the death of William II in 1189, the Sicilian throne was hotly contested. The island's barons rejected Constance's claim and instead crowned a local noble named Tancred. Henry, eager to press his wife's claim, launched an invasion. Constance accompanied him, confident that the Sicilian people would accept her as their rightful queen. They didn't. She was captured in 1191 by Tancred's forces, betrayed by the very land she hoped would embrace her. For over a year, she was held hostage in Salerno, a political prisoner used as a bargaining chip. In letters to the Pope, Tancred insisted she was treated with dignity. But captivity is captivity. Her meals, her correspondence, her very movements were controlled. There are stories, possibly embroidered, possibly true, that she was kept in a tower, her attendants bribed, and her health deliberately weakened. The Pope, uncomfortable with the whole situation, eventually intervened, and Constance was released. But the damage had been done. The Empress of the West had been humiliated, paraded like a trophy, then discarded. By the time she returned to Henry, she was changed, hardened. Some say cold. She had learned what power cost, and what it felt like to be used and forgotten, and yet she endured. At the age of 40, Constance did something few thought possible. She gave birth. Her son, the future Frederick II, would go on to become one of the most remarkable rulers of the medieval world. But his birth was met with suspicion. How could a woman of her age, after years of illness and imprisonment, suddenly conceive? Critics whispered that the baby wasn't hers at all. To silence the rumors, Constance gave birth publicly, in a tent surrounded by noble witnesses. She nursed the baby in front of them. She made sure no one could question the legitimacy of her child, or her place in history. But Constance would not live long to enjoy the fruits of her survival. Henry VI died young, and Constance, finally, Queen of Sicily in her own right, ruled briefly as regent for her infant son. In 1198, just 2 years after her husband's death, and a few months after becoming sole ruler, Constance herself died, of illness, some say. Others believe poison may have hastened her end. She was buried in the Cathedral of Palermo, her marble tomb quietly grand, her face carved in serene stone. But her life had been anything but serene. She had been a royal pawn, an empress prisoner, a late mother, and a reluctant queen. She had walked through fire for her crown and died holding it loosely. So tonight, as the shadows of sleep begin to curl around the edges of your mind, remember Constance of Sicily, not as a distant medieval queen, but as a woman pushed onto a throne she never asked for, a bride, late to the altar, nearly killed by politics before and after the wedding night. Her life was a chain of delays, doubts, and dangers, but in the end, she left behind a son who would shake the world. close your eyes. Let the noise of empires fade and drift into the quiet truth of history's forgotten women who wore crowns not as symbols of power, but as heavy, hollow promises. Now, let me tell the story of Isabella of Hainaut. Imagine, for a moment, the grand stone halls of a medieval castle. The cold drafts slipping beneath heavy oak doors, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows on tapestry-covered walls, and the muffled sounds of a court preparing for its next move in the endless game of crowns and alliances. It is within such walls that Isabella of Hainaut, Queen of France, lived a brief, tragic life. Her story a cruel whisper of youthful promise crushed by illness, politics, and relentless expectation. Isabella's life began under the weight of duty long before she was old enough to understand what it meant. Born around 1170, she was the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Hainaut, a powerful nobleman in the Low Countries, whose land stretched across parts of modern-day Belgium and northern France. In those times, a noble daughter was more than a person. She was a piece in the grand chessboard of diplomacy. Her marriage, a contract sealed with blood, gold, and sometimes the lives of entire kingdoms. At just 16 or 17 years old, Isabella was wed to Philip II, King of France, also known as Philip Augustus. Their marriage was not a romantic union of two hearts, but a strategic alliance designed to consolidate Philip's power, strengthen his claim over contested lands, and secure his kingdom's borders. For Isabella, it was the beginning of a life where her personal desires counted for little, and her value was measured by her ability to bear heirs and stabilize a kingdom. But the royal marriage came with burdens heavier than the velvet cloaks and jeweled crowns. The stress of court life, always teetering between celebration and conspiracy, was immense. Philip II was a determined and sometimes ruthless ruler, focused on expanding French territory and diminishing the power of the English Plantagenets. This political climate was tense, a constant pressure cooker of alliances, betrayals, and war. Isabella found herself at the center of it all, expected to be the perfect queen while also serving as a symbol of French strength. Behind the grandeur, however, Isabella's health was quietly deteriorating. We now know that she suffered from tuberculosis, a chronic illness that was poorly understood in the Middle Ages, but devastating in its effects. Often called consumption because it seemed to consume the body from within, tuberculosis was rampant in medieval Europe, spreading through crowded castles, monasteries, and towns where poor ventilation and close quarters provided a breeding ground for the deadly bacteria. Tuberculosis attacked Isabella's lungs first. The persistent cough, the gradual loss of breath, the feverish nights and profuse sweating, all were symptoms that medieval physicians could do little to alleviate. Without antibiotics or effective treatments, the disease progressed relentlessly. Each day became a battle against the slow starvation of her own body, her strength ebbing away like the fading light of a dying candle. Her health struggles were compounded by repeated pregnancies and miscarriages. The toll of childbearing in the Middle Ages was brutal, especially for young queens like Isabella, whose reproductive value was considered paramount. Miscarriages were common and often fatal. Without proper medical knowledge or care, the physical and emotional stress they caused weakened her already fragile body. Historians suggest that the combination of tuberculosis, and pregnancy-related complications led to her rapid decline. Isabella's life was a tragic example of how royal women, despite their elevated status, were vulnerable to the same harsh realities that plagued commoners. While kings commanded armies and shaped the destinies of nations, their queens often lived on the knife's edge of health, sacrificed to produce heirs, and dismissed when their bodies failed them. The political stress surrounding Isabella's marriage cannot be underestimated either. Philip II's reign was marked by constant conflict with England, with the infamous Angevin Empire stretching across much of Western Europe. Every decision at court had ramifications far beyond the castle walls. For Isabella, this meant not only physical demands, but psychological strain. Court gossip, shifting loyalties, and the fear of failing to secure a future dynasty all contributed to her declining condition. Her death at around 20 years old shocked the French court, but was met with a resigned acceptance among contemporaries. Early death among young queens was tragic, but far from unusual. Still, Isabella's passing had consequences. Her short marriage left a son, Louis VIII, who would later ascend the throne. The brief union had cemented an alliance that helped Philip II consolidate his power, but at a tremendous human cost. After her death, Isabella was buried with honors befitting a queen, but her memory faded quickly beneath the long shadow of Philip's military and political achievements. She became one of many royal brides whose lives were cut short before they could fulfill their expected roles fully, sacrificed to the relentless demands of medieval politics. Isabella's story is not just about one girl's untimely death. It is a window into the precarious existence of medieval royal women, trapped between power and vulnerability. They were celebrated as queens, yet often confined by their illnesses and expectations, victims of a society that prized dynastic success over personal survival. So, as you lay back and let the quiet darkness pull you under, think of Isabella, not just as a name in history books, but as a young woman trapped within stone walls, fighting a disease she couldn't see or understand, bearing the hopes of a kingdom on her fragile shoulders, and slipping quietly away into the night, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and silent strength. Now, let's talk about Margaret of Anjou's doomed betrothal. In the tangled webs of medieval European politics, marriage was less about love and more about power. Alliances forged with steel, not silk. For young noblewomen, their futures were often sealed by contracts scribbled far from their knowing eyes. Few stories capture this cruel chess game better than that of Margaret of Anjou, a woman whose beauty and spirit were destined to be caught between rival thrones, and whose first betrothal ended in a mysterious death that shook the balance of power itself. Margaret was born in 1430 into the House of Anjou, a cadet branch of the French royal family, rooted in the sun-dappled lands of Provence. Her lineage was impeccable, her bloodline noble enough to promise alliances that could sway kings and kingdoms. But from her earliest days, Margaret's life was a pawn's life, less a story of choice and more a narrative dictated by treaties, dowries, and the ambitions of men. As a child, Margaret's future was charted with an unsettling certainty. Her first betrothal was arranged to Frederick, King of Naples, a match designed to cement ties between Anjou and Naples, two realms that were often at odds with the sprawling influence of the Aragonese rulers in southern Italy. This marriage was meant to be a powerful union, uniting claims and pooling resources to challenge Aragon's growing dominance. But before the wedding could be celebrated, fate intervened with a dark whisper. Frederick died suddenly in 1435, under circumstances shrouded in suspicion. Some chroniclers of the time noted his death as an illness, a fever that swept through Naples with deadly efficiency. But others, closer to the politics of the era, whispered something more sinister. Poison. Poison was a tool of choice in medieval courts, as subtle as a dagger and just as deadly. It was often the weapon of those who preferred shadow to open battle, quietly removing rivals without the risk of public scandal or rebellion. Frederick's demise raised eyebrows in every royal court from Paris to London. Why would someone want Frederick dead? The answer lies in the brutal calculus of alliances. The marriage between Margaret and Frederick was a threat to the Aragonese. Naples was a prize contested fiercely by the House of Anjou and the Crown of Aragon, each eager to control the strategic gateway to the Mediterranean. If Frederick married Margaret, it could have strengthened Anjou's hand, tipping the scales against Aragon's claim. It's no coincidence, then, that shortly after Frederick's death, Margaret was redirected elsewhere, to England, of all places. There, she would marry Henry VI, the fragile and often troubled king, whose reign was marked by civil war and contested succession. This sudden pivot in Margaret's fate was not a matter of chance, but of political necessity, a forced rearrangement of the continent's chessboard. But back to Frederick's death. The swiftness of it was unsettling, particularly in an era when kings were surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and enemies alike. Poisoning was notoriously difficult to prove. Symptoms often mimicked natural illnesses, and those who administered it did so with the utmost secrecy. There were few investigations, no formal inquiries, and certainly no public trial. A king's death was too valuable a moment for speculation. Instead, the court moved swiftly to manage rumors, suppress dissent, and reforge alliances. Margaret, meanwhile, was a child caught in the storm. In the records, she barely appears at this point, but we can imagine the confusion and loss she must have felt. The betrothal was her ticket to power, her introduction to a world of influence. Then, with Frederick's death, the future she'd been promised collapsed. For her family, the stakes were higher than personal grief. Margaret's betrothal to Frederick had been carefully negotiated to keep the House of Anjou strong in Italy. Losing Frederick meant losing that foothold, and shifting to England was a dramatic, risky gamble. Henry VI was heir to the English crown, but his position was weak. England was locked in the brutal 100 Years' War with France, a war that drained resources, shattered families, and fractured loyalties. Marrying into England wasn't just a change of suitor, it was a plunge into chaos. Margaret's arrival in England would later change history. Her marriage to Henry VI set in motion the Wars of the Roses, a bloody dynastic conflict that tore the English nobility apart for decades. But long before that chapter, there was the shadow of Frederick's death, a reminder that royal brides were not just prize or promise, but also targets and symbols in deadly games of power. The poisoning theory, while never definitively proven, fits the pattern of ruthless medieval diplomacy. Throughout Europe, Royal deaths often coincided with shifts in alliance. The fate of queens and princesses was inseparable from the fate of their lands. When a bride was lost, so was a political strategy, and sometimes so was a war avoided or ignited. The lack of detailed contemporary records on Frederick's death is frustrating to modern historians. Chroniclers of the time were often partisan, their writings colored by loyalties and fears. The silence or vague statements around Frederick's demise speak volumes. They hint at a cover-up, an attempt to preserve the fragile peace, or mask the violent undercurrents of power. Margaret herself would later be known as the Tragic Rose of Anjou, a nickname earned not just for her beauty, but for the hardships she endured. She arrived in England as a teenager, suddenly thrust into a kingdom where her husband's authority was contested, where nobles plotted and armies marched on London's streets. The shadows that may have killed Frederick seemed to follow her, as betrayal and bloodshed marred her life. In many ways, Margaret's first betrothal was a prelude to the tragedies that would mark her life. The death of Frederick was not just a personal loss, but a violent statement, a reminder that royal marriages were high stakes, where lives were expendable and loyalty was a fragile illusion. So when you think of medieval brides, remember Margaret's story, not just the one where she married Henry VI, but the earlier, darker tale of a doomed engagement cut short by death. It is a stark example of how closely love, power, and danger were intertwined in a world where a single poison could change the fate of kingdoms. As you settle deeper into your night, imagine Margaret, young, hopeful, yet caught in the deadly currents of medieval politics. Her story, like so many others, reminds us that behind the grand castles and royal titles were lives lived under constant threat, where even the promise of marriage could be a sentence in disguise. And with that thought, let the quiet of the night cradle you, knowing history's whispers carry stories darker and more delicate than any fairy tale ever told. Now, let's talk about the brief life of Blanche of France. In the glittering courts of medieval Europe, marriage was not just a union between two people. It was a game of thrones, a bargaining chip for alliances, peace treaties, and power. Among the many royal brides who never reached their wedding night, Blanche of France stands out, not for scandal or tragedy on a battlefield, but for a life that flickered briefly, marked by promise, repeated betrothals, and an untimely death that left whispers and rumors in its wake. Blanche was born in 1253 to Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, and his queen, Margaret of Provence. The princess arrived into a world where royal daughters were pawns in the chess game of European politics, her childhood colored by the weight of expectation and the relentless plotting of alliances. From an early age, Blanche's fate was less about personal happiness and more about the ambitions of kings and nobles. As the daughter of one of France's most revered monarchs, Blanche's marriage prospects were the subject of intense negotiations. Her hand was promised and repromised in the courts of France, England, and beyond. The hope was simple yet ruthless: to secure peace with neighbors, to strengthen ties with powerful houses, and to extend the influence of the French crown. Her earliest betrothal was to Alfonso, son of King James I of Aragon. This match was intended to seal a treaty between France and Aragon, two kingdoms with overlapping ambitions in the Mediterranean. But politics shifted, as it often did, and the engagement was dissolved before it ever reached the altar. Next came the prospect of marriage to Edward, the heir to the English throne. The English and French crowns had been locked in decades of rivalry and conflict, punctuated by occasional truces sealed with royal marriages. If Blanche and Edward had wed, it could have reshaped the future of both nations. Yet once again, the plan unraveled, thwarted by political tensions and the complex web of European allegiances. Despite these broken promises, Blanche's life was not idle. She was raised with all the education a princess could receive: languages, religion, etiquette, and governance. Her role was not simply ornamental. She was a living symbol of her father's reach and influence, and her presence alone was a tool of diplomacy. But amid these plans and promises, Blanche's health began to fail. In an era when disease was rampant and medical knowledge was limited, even royalty was vulnerable. Sources suggest that Blanche suffered from an illness. Some say tuberculosis, or a respiratory disease, that progressively weakened her. Her death came suddenly in 1283, at just 30 years old, shortly before what might have been her final marriage. She had been betrothed yet again, this time to Edmund Crouchback, the younger brother of King Edward I of England. This match was meant to cement peace after years of conflict between England and France, and both courts viewed it as crucial. But Blanche never made it to the altar. Instead, her body gave out, and she died in Paris, far from the pomp and ceremony that should have accompanied her transition from princess to queen. Her death sent ripples through the courts. Some saw it as divine punishment, a judgment against her or her family. Such interpretations were common in the medieval mindset, where illness and death were often seen as signs of God's favor or wrath. Chroniclers wrote of her passing with a mixture of sadness and moralizing, suggesting that her failure to marry was a sign of divine will. Others whispered darker rumors. Poisoning was a common fear in royal courts, where rivals had as many motives as opportunities. Blanche's repeated broken engagements may have angered powerful nobles who felt their plans threatened. Or perhaps she was a victim of internal court intrigue, a casualty of factions battling for control behind the throne. Yet no concrete evidence ever emerged. Her death remains shrouded in mystery, a quiet end amid the chaos of medieval power struggles. In the days following her passing, France mourned quietly. Blanche was buried at Royaumont Abbey, a Cistercian monastery north of Paris, a resting place for the French royal family. The abbey itself stood as a symbol of piety and power, and Blanche's tomb was marked with respect befitting a princess, though not with the grandeur of a queen. Her legacy, if one can call it that, is defined by absence. She was a bride promised to crowns but never crowned, a figure caught between the ambitions of kings and the harsh realities of life and death in medieval Europe. Blanche's story reflects the precarious existence of royal women, whose fates were dictated by political necessity rather than personal choice. Her brief life also highlights a cruel paradox of medieval royal marriage, that it could be a path to power or a route to an early grave. For many princesses, marriage was less about love or family, and more about survival. Those who died young often vanished quietly from the historical record, their stories replaced by the political consequences of their absence. In Blanche's case, historians can only piece together fragments, charters listing betrothals, court letters, and monastic obituaries. These documents hint at a woman caught in the crossfire of Europe's shifting alliances, her body fragile beneath the armor of dynastic ambition. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of Blanche, not just as a footnote in royal history, but as a human being, a woman who carried the weight of kingdoms on her shoulders, who dreamed of a future never realized, and who left behind questions that history has yet to answer. Her life was short, but it was emblematic of the countless royal brides who vanished before their wedding night, not from lack of importance, but because their lives were woven into the dangerous tapestry of medieval power. And so, as you rest, let the quiet mystery of Blanche of France linger in your mind, a reminder that behind every crown lies a story of hope, ambition, and sometimes untimely death. Now let me tell the story of Joan of France. The history of medieval Europe is written not only in wars and kings, but also in the silent tragedies of brides who never made it to their wedding nights. Joan of France was one such figure, a princess caught between kingdoms, a pawn in the dangerous game of dynastic alliance, and a woman whose life was abruptly cut short before she could claim her throne. Joan was born in 1343, the daughter of King John II of France, known as John the Good. It was a turbulent time. The 100 Years' War between England and France had erupted decades earlier, sending shock waves through the noble courts and common villages alike. Armies marched, cities burned, and a plague swept the continent. Amid this chaos, marriages became political chess moves, carefully arranged to cement peace or forge strategic partnerships. Joan's engagement to Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, was no exception. The Black Prince was the eldest son of King Edward III of England and one of the most formidable knights of his generation. His name alone struck fear across French fields, especially after his stunning victory at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. To unite the two rival kingdoms, Joan's marriage to Edward was arranged as a symbol of hope and reconciliation. If the French princess could become the English queen, perhaps the bloody war could be tempered. But Joan's journey was fraught from the start. Born into privilege, she was raised in the gilded halls of the French court, where luxury masked the grim realities beyond castle walls. From a young age, Joan was groomed for her future role, not just as a royal wife, but as a political instrument. She learned to read and write, was educated in the intricacies of court diplomacy, and prepared to cross one of the most dangerous borders in medieval Europe, the English Channel, at a time when her two nations were mortal enemies. In 1360, when Joan was just 17, the Treaty of Bretigny was signed, an agreement intended to pause the fighting between England and France. This treaty not only granted vast territories to the English, but also confirmed Joan's betrothal to Edward. For a moment, it seemed that peace, however fragile, was within reach. Yet, Joan never made it across the Channel. In 1361, as Joan prepared for her journey to England, disaster struck. Europe was in the grip of the second devastating wave of the Black Death. This plague had already ravaged populations decades earlier, and now it was back with a vengeance. Towns and villages emptied overnight. The rich and poor alike succumbed to the fever, chills, and the hideous swellings that marked the disease. The French court, was not spared. Joan fell ill. The official records state she died of plague in 1361, likely in Bordeaux or nearby, before ever boarding a ship bound for England. Her death was a blow not just to her family, but to the fragile hopes of peace between the warring nations. But the story doesn't end there. Because in medieval politics, death was rarely simple, rumors and suspicion clung to Joan's demise like shadows. Plague or not, some whispered that Joan's death was no accident, that it was no mere disease, but a poison delivered in the guise of fate. After all, political sabotage was common in these deadly times. Assassinations disguised as illnesses, veiled threats made in chalices of wine, and carefully engineered accidents were tools of statecraft as lethal as any sword. The Black Prince himself had enemies who would have welcomed the collapse of the marriage alliance, and in France, rival factions might have seen Joan as a liability, too much a symbol of a peace that some nobles found threatening to their power. For Joan, the stakes were immense. If she had lived and married Edward, she would have been Queen of England, but also a vital bridge between two opposing crowns. Her presence in the English court might have shifted loyalties, altered alliances, and changed the course of the war. Her death left a void, and the fragile peace soon unraveled. Edward the Black Prince was reportedly devastated by Joan's death, though he later married another woman, Joan of Kent. His grief over losing the French princess was noted in contemporary chronicles. He never forgot the alliance that might have been, and the political promise extinguished alongside Joan's life. This tragic episode highlights the precariousness of royal brides in medieval Europe. They were expected to cross battle lines, to serve as symbols of peace. Yet their lives were precarious, caught in the crossfire of rivalries far beyond their control. Illness, accident, and foul play were constant threats. Joan's story also reveals the harsh realities faced by women in the royal Game of Thrones. They were often sent away young, removed from their homes, to live in foreign courts where suspicion and danger lurked in every shadow. Their bodies and fates were controlled by the ambitions of fathers, kings, and councils. The prospect of childbirth alone was deadly, and the added burden of political intrigue made their existence all the more fragile. In the centuries since Joan's death, historians have pieced together what they can from fragmentary records. The plague explanation remains the official cause, supported by accounts of the epidemic raging at the time. Yet, the persistent whisper of poisoning lingers in the margins of history books and academic debates, a testament to the suspicion that pervaded medieval courts. Joan's death, coming before her marriage and before she could set foot in England, left a chilling question hanging over the history of royal brides. How often were these tragedies natural, and how often were they manufactured? As you lie quietly tonight, drifting toward sleep, think of Joan of France, not just as a footnote in the long history of the 100 Years' War, but as a young woman whose life and death carried the weight of kingdoms. She was a princess who never reached her throne, a bride who never crossed the channel, and a queen who never was. Her story is a haunting reminder that behind the glittering halls and regal ceremonies of medieval Europe, power was ruthless, and the price of peace was often paid in blood. Now, let me tell the tale of Marie of Brittany's vanishing act. In the tangled web of medieval alliances, where marriage was often more about land, power, and politics than love, some stories slip into shadow, whispers lost between the pages of dusty tomes. One such story is that of Marie of Brittany, a name that flickers like a candle's flame, barely caught before it disappears into darkness. She became known in the annals of history as the Bride of the Mist, a spectral figure whose life ended in mystery, her disappearance cloaked in fog both literal and metaphorical. Marie was born into the noble house of Brittany, a land of rugged coastlines, misty forests, and fierce warriors who had long resisted outside rule. The 13th century was an era when Brittany's position was precarious, caught between the ambitions of France and England. Its dukes and duchesses became pawns in a grand chessboard of royal strategies. Marie's betrothal was part of this larger game. Her family arranged a match with a French nobleman of considerable influence. It was supposed to cement ties between Brittany and the French crown, strengthening loyalties and creating a buffer against English claims. A union made in cold strategy, but one that demanded warmth and promise on the surface, an emblem of peace and alliance. And yet, Marie never made it to the altar. The tale of her disappearance begins with the preparations for her journey from Brittany to France. In those days, crossing such distances was no small matter. Travel was perilous. Roads were rough and often under threat from bandits or hostile factions. Weather could turn suddenly, especially in the coastal regions where the sea mist rolled in thick and unrelenting. A bride's procession was a slow-moving target, vulnerable and heavily guarded. But even the best protection could not guarantee safety. Chroniclers of the period tell us that Marie's party set out from her family's estate under a sky heavy with gray clouds. The sea breeze carried a chill that bit through even the warmest cloaks. The journey should have taken only days, but news soon trickled back to Brittany that Marie had vanished, without trace, without word, without explanation. Some reports say the bridal party was caught in a violent storm that scattered their retinue, leaving Marie isolated somewhere on the fog-covered roads. Others whispered darker possibilities: ambush, kidnapping, or worse. The nobility were no strangers to intrigue, and the idea that rivals might have intercepted the bride to prevent the marriage was not far-fetched. What fuels the mystery even further is the eerie consistency of these reports. Even years after her disappearance, chroniclers referred to Marie as the Bride of the Mist, a ghostly figure who seemed to dissolve into the fog like a phantom. One of the most haunting records comes from a French monk writing decades later, who described a woman wandering the wilderness, lost and alone, her silken dress torn, her face pale as the moon. The monk claimed to have seen her near a chapel in a remote forest, but when he approached, she vanished like smoke. Whether this was a hallucination, a pious allegory, or a fragment of folklore, it cemented Marie's place in legend rather than history. The official stance of the court was more pragmatic. Marie was declared dead, her absence a casualty of the times. No body was ever found, no grave marked, and no final letter or message was recorded. This silence only deepened the enigma. To understand why Marie's disappearance gripped so many imaginations, we need to consider the fragile status of women in medieval noble society. Brides like Marie were often young, sometimes barely in their teens, thrust into marriages arranged not for affection, but for political advantage. Their safety and well-being depended on the goodwill of strangers, the competence of their guards, and the shifting tides of power. A lost bride was a disaster, not only a personal tragedy, but a political embarrassment. Without her marriage, the alliance weakened, promises were broken, and enemies found opportunity in the gap. Some historians suggest that Marie might have been a victim of the very political tensions her betrothal sought to resolve. Breton factions resisting French dominance could have seen her as a threat, eliminating her to sabotage the union. Alternatively, French nobles wary of Brittany's independence might have acted to prevent the marriage, fearful that it would strengthen a rival power. There is also a whispered theory that Marie chose to disappear, fleeing the suffocating expectations of court life and a marriage she never desired. Escape was nearly impossible for noblewomen, but not unheard of. In a world where daughters were sold like currency, to reject the contract was to risk everything, including exile or death. Could the Bride of the Mist have chosen freedom over obligation? The question remains unanswered. Regardless of the cause, Marie's vanishing left ripples through the years. The nobleman she was betrothed to remarried, but the alliance they had hoped to secure never fully took hold. Brittany continued its uneasy dance between kingdoms, and Marie became a footnote, one that sparked legends. Today, historians still debate her fate. Was she lost in a storm, taken by enemies, or did she step into the unknown on her own terms? The lack of concrete evidence only invites speculation, allowing her story to hover between fact and folklore. As you imagine the mist curling over Breton hills, the soft clatter of horses' hooves swallowed by fog, think of Marie, the bride who vanished. In the quiet spaces between history's pages, her ghost lingers, a reminder of the peril and uncertainty that shrouded the lives of royal brides in the medieval world. Tonight, as you settle beneath your blankets, let the story of Marie of Brittany, the Bride of the Mist, carry you softly into sleep. For sometimes, the most haunting tales are not those written in blood or fire, but those whispered through the silence of a lost name. For now, let's talk about the princess betrothed to the Black Death. The year was 1348. Europe was already shrouded in dread, as whispers of a terrifying sickness had begun to spread like wildfire from port to port, village to village, city to city. What would come to be known as the Black Death was slowly but relentlessly sweeping across the continent, leaving ruin in its wake. And in the midst of this horror, a young English princess named Joan, daughter of King Edward III, was preparing for a journey that would forever link her name to one of history's deadliest pandemics. Joan was no ordinary princess. Born into the Plantagenet dynasty, she carried the weight of her family's ambitions, hopes, and alliances. Royal marriages in the 14th century were not love stories. They were political chess moves designed to cement power, forge peace, and expand influence. Joan's betrothal to Pedro of Castile was precisely such a move, aimed at strengthening ties between England and the Kingdom of Castile in the Iberian Peninsula. The marriage was meant to be a beacon of hope, a diplomatic alliance in turbulent times. But the road to her wedding night would be paved with death. At the time, the Black Death was still a terrifying mystery. Its symptoms were gruesome: high fever, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, blackened skin patches, and an almost certain death sentence within days. No one knew how it spread, and no remedy was yet conceived. Entire towns were emptied, farms abandoned, and social order frayed as panic grew. Joan's journey from England to Castile was to be a grand procession. She was accompanied by a wedding train, a convoy of nobles, knights, servants, and attendants who would ensure the young princess's safe passage. But the plague did not discriminate between kings and peasants, nobles and serfs. It traveled silently alongside Joan's entourage, hidden in the crowded carriages, the shared cups, and the poorly ventilated chambers where the weary travelers rested. Records from the time tell us that as Joan and her retinue crossed through France, the plague followed close behind. Small towns refused to let the procession enter. Some villages sent their own people fleeing. But Joan's group had to press onward. There was no turning back. The diplomatic stakes were too high, the marriage too critical. Still, one by one, members of the wedding train began to fall ill. Some collapsed on the road. Others were buried hastily in shallow graves beside the roadside. The air grew thick with fear and the stench of death. Joan herself did not escape the plague's grasp. Despite her royal status and the best care the medieval world could offer, she succumbed. Historians estimate that she died somewhere along the journey, before she could even reach her future husband, Pedro of Castile. The date of her death is recorded ambiguously, but the devastation was clear. Not a single member of the wedding party survived the trip. The tragedy sent shockwaves through both England and Castile. The hoped-for alliance died with Joan, and with it, the fragile diplomatic peace the marriage was meant to secure. Pedro of Castile was left without his bride, and Edward III faced not only personal grief, but political uncertainty. The death of Joan was not an isolated incident. Throughout the mid-14th century, countless brides and grooms alike never made it to their wedding nights. Royal courts, usually bustling with ceremony and celebration, became sites of mourning and fear. The Black Death had a way of upending the natural order, turning joyous occasions into somber reminders of mortality. Joan's story encapsulates this grim reality perfectly. Her life was shaped by political necessity, and her death was shaped by a ruthless, invisible enemy. The fact that an entire royal wedding procession could be wiped out by disease was unheard of and sent a clear message to all courts across Europe. No status, no wealth, no privilege could protect one from the plague's wrath. The impact of Joan's death went beyond the personal and political. It also reflected the broader devastation of the Black Death on medieval society. The plague decimated roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, with some regions losing more. The scarcity of labor shifted power dynamics between peasants and nobles, weakened feudal structures, and led to economic upheaval that would echo for centuries. Within the halls of power, the loss of heirs and brides like Joan created succession crises and forced monarchs to rethink their strategies. Marriages had been the glue holding alliances together, but now, with so many young nobles dying before their time, kingdoms scrambled to find new matches, sometimes with younger, less politically advantageous partners, or with less care for long-term peace. Joan's death also highlights the role of women in these political marriages. Princesses like her were often sent far from home with little agency, expected to marry strangers and bear children to secure dynastic lines. They were political pawns, valuable as symbols and vessels for alliances, but vulnerable to the harsh realities of medieval life, including disease. Despite the sadness surrounding Joan's fate, her story survives as a powerful example of how the Black Death changed the course of history, not only in terms of population loss, but in the disruption of royal plans, alliances, and the very fabric of medieval diplomacy. The echoes of Joan's journey remind us that even the most carefully planned political moves could be undone by forces beyond human control. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the young princess whose wedding train was swallowed whole by an unstoppable plague. A reminder that history is not just made in courts and castles, but also in the silent spread of disease, in the quiet deaths that ripple through time, and in the lost stories that never reached their final chapter. Now let's talk about Eleanor of Castile's sister. In the medieval world, marriage was rarely about love. It was about alliances, territories, peace treaties, power balances. For royal families, daughters were the currency of diplomacy, exchanged across borders with promises of unity and prosperity. But this currency was fragile, often paid in blood and tears long before the wedding feast. Few tales reveal this grim reality better than the tragic story of a royal bride who never reached her groom. The sister of Eleanor of Castile, a woman whose journey to France ended in death. Eleanor of Castile is a name many know. Queen consort to England's Edward I, a woman renowned for her grace and political savvy. But before Eleanor's own marriage sealed one of medieval Europe's most famous unions, another Castilian princess was sent away with hopes just as high and hopes just as easily shattered. This was her sister, a young woman born into the House of Castile during a time when Spain was a patchwork of Christian kingdoms and Muslim caliphates, where war and fragile truces shaped every move. The sister's name is lost to many chroniclers, overshadowed by Eleanor's later fame. She was promised to a French noble, an alliance designed to strengthen ties between Castile and France, both kingdoms eager to counterbalance the power of neighboring realms. The marriage was arranged when she was still a girl, barely into her teens. Like many noble brides of the era, she was expected to leave her home, her family, and all familiarity behind to live among strangers in a foreign court. But the journey itself was a trial unlike any other. Travel in the Middle Ages was dangerous at best, deadly at worst. Roads were rough tracks carved through forests, mountains, and marshlands, often little more than muddy paths where bandits lurked and weather raged unchecked. For a princess traveling from Spain to France, the route meant crossing vast distances on horseback or in slow, uncomfortable carriages. It meant nights spent in drafty inns where disease spread like wildfire. This princess's caravan was no exception. It began in the bright light of early spring. She left Castile surrounded by attendants, guards, servants, ladies-in-waiting, each sworn to protect her. Her clothes were fine, her provisions plentiful, and her heart likely filled with a mix of excitement and fear. Yet the air they breathed was thick with risk. Epidemics haunted these journeys, and no amount of silk or gold could shield a traveler from fever, dysentery, or plague. As days turned into weeks, illness began to strike. First, a cough here, a fever there. The constant travel weakened the princess's body. Medieval medicine had little to offer beyond herbs, prayers, and rest, luxuries scarce on the road. By the time they reached the Pyrenees, the rugged mountains separating Spain from France, the princess's condition had deteriorated severely. Her attendants whispered fears, but no one dared speak openly. To admit weakness in a royal procession was to invite disaster. If word spread that the bride was ill, political rivals could seize the opportunity to break the alliance. So, the group pressed on, determined to reach their destination before rumors could take hold. But fate had other plans. The princess succumbed somewhere in southern France, far from her homeland and even farther from the court where she was to become a queen. Whether it was the plague, a sudden fever, or a complication from an old wound, no one knows for sure. What remains clear is that her death was swift and silent. The shock of losing a royal bride in transit rippled through both Castile and France. It was not just a personal tragedy, but a political crisis. The alliance she was meant to cement lay in ruins, and the fate of two kingdoms hung in the balance. How to handle the body of a princess who had never been crowned? How to preserve her dignity and honor in a world obsessed with appearances? Medieval customs demanded careful treatment of royal remains, especially when the deceased was far from home. The body had to be transported back safely, protected from decay during a journey that could take weeks. This was a task often left to the most trusted servants, accompanied by sacred rites and careful preparations. The princess's body was wrapped meticulously in linen soaked with fragrant incense, myrrh, frankincense, and other resins, known both for their spiritual symbolism and their ability to mask the stench of death. This wrapping was not just practical, but deeply symbolic, meant to preserve her purity and honor as she traveled back to Castile. The slow procession home was shrouded in grief. Each stop was marked by prayers, candles, and moments of silence. Townspeople and nobles alike mourned the unseen bride, aware that she had died carrying their hopes and alliances with her. When the body finally returned to Castile, the princess was buried with honors befitting a queen, even if she had never worn the crown. Her death served as a grim reminder of the brutal risks royal brides faced. They were pawns in a game far larger than themselves, expected to survive harsh journeys, dangerous childbirth, and often brutal political intrigues. The road to the altar was not just long, it was often deadly. For Eleanor of Castile, her sister's fate cast a shadow over her own marriage. Eleanor would go on to marry Edward I and become a powerful queen, but the memory of what happened to her sister lingered. It was a constant reminder that even royal blood could not guarantee safety, and that the price of peace was sometimes paid in the silence of a coffin. So next time you imagine a medieval wedding with its golden gowns and grand feasts, remember the hidden stories, the brides who never arrived, the journeys that ended in tragedy, the bodies wrapped in incense on cold roads. Behind every alliance was a risk, and behind every bride, a story of sacrifice. Now, as you lie down to rest, imagine that distant road, the slow, mournful procession of a royal body wrapped in fragrant cloth, crossing borders and mountains, carrying a kingdom's hopes and a family's heartbreak. Let the scent of myrrh and the whispers of lost brides soothe you into sleep, as history's forgotten princesses remind us of the cost of power in a world ruled by alliances and sacrifice. Now let me tell the story of Margaret of Hungary. In the tangled weave of medieval history, some names shine bright with legends of glory, conquest, or scandal. Others, like Margaret of Hungary, glow softly, like a candle flickering against a storm. Born in 1242, Margaret's story is one of piety, sacrifice, and a life lived under the heavy weight of political expectation and religious devotion. She was a princess, a bride, and later a saint. But her journey was marked not by dazzling triumphs or tragic betrayals, but by the quiet tragedy of a young woman caught between family duty and the brutal realities of her time. Margaret was born into the Arpad dynasty, a royal bloodline that ruled over the Kingdom of Hungary and Croatia. Her father was Bela IV, a king tasked with the impossible: to rebuild a shattered kingdom after the devastating Mongol invasion of 1241 to 1242, which had ravaged the land, slaughtered thousands, and left the kingdom teetering on collapse. Margaret arrived just after this catastrophe, her birth itself almost a symbol of hope amidst destruction. As the daughter of Bela IV, Margaret was destined for a life that was anything but ordinary. Royal daughters were political chess pieces, each marriage contract a treaty, a promise, a weapon to be wielded in the endless game of alliances and power. Margaret was no exception. But from an early age, something about Margaret set her apart. She was raised in the royal courts, but unlike many of her contemporaries who saw marriage as their ultimate destiny, Margaret was drawn to the church. She was deeply pious, educated in religious doctrine, and dedicated to a life of devotion. Her family recognized this, but also understood that her piety could serve a political purpose. Sanctity was a powerful asset in medieval Europe, one that could elevate the status of a royal house beyond the reach of mere armies and treaties. At the age of around 7 or 8, Margaret was sent to the Dominican convent of Veszprém, a strategic placement where she was nurtured in the spiritual discipline of the order. It was a time when childhood was short and decisions were swift. Girls were expected to accept their roles as brides or nuns without question. For Margaret, the convent was both a refuge and a prison, a place where her faith flourished, but her worldly options shrank. Yet, unlike many royal daughters who were forcibly married off to cement alliances, Margaret never married. Instead, she took the veil and dedicated her life to religious service. This was not always a peaceful path. Her decision challenged the very fabric of dynastic politics. Bela IV himself had hoped for political marriages to strengthen his dynasty, but Margaret's sanctity made her untouchable. She became a symbol of spiritual power, a living saint in the making. Margaret's commitment to the church did not mean an easy life. In fact, her existence was marked by intense hardships, physical suffering, and austere discipline. Medieval convents were places of strict rules, fasting, long hours of prayer, flagellation, and isolation from the outside world. Margaret embraced this suffering willingly, seeing it as a path to holiness and salvation. Her health was fragile, and she suffered from various illnesses that slowly wore down her young body. The political stakes around Margaret's life were enormous. Her father and brother, Stephen V, saw her holiness as both a blessing and a threat. On one hand, having a saintly family member elevated the dynasty's prestige and offered spiritual protection in a brutal world. On the other, Margaret's refusal to marry meant the loss of a valuable political alliance. Tensions simmered, but no marriage was arranged. As the years passed, Margaret's reputation for piety grew beyond the convent walls. Miracles were attributed to her intercession. Stories circulated of her healing the sick and protecting the kingdom from harm. Pilgrims traveled to see her, seeking prayers and blessings. This made her a unique figure, half royal princess, half mystic, standing at the crossroads of politics and religion. Yet her life remained a quiet tragedy. Despite her sanctity and royal blood, Margaret died young, at only 28 years old, in 1270. Her death was mourned across Hungary, but also marked the end of a fragile balance between spiritual devotion and dynastic ambition. The Arpad dynasty continued, but the loss of Margaret was felt deeply. In death, Margaret's legacy only grew. She was beatified and later canonized, becoming Saint Margaret of Hungary, a beacon of faith and purity. Her feast day, celebrated on January 18th, reminds us that even in a time of blood-soaked battles and ruthless power plays, lives like Margaret's carried a quiet light. Her story challenges the usual narratives of medieval royal women. She wasn't a bride who died mysteriously on her wedding night, nor a victim of palace intrigue. Instead, she was a woman who chose a different path, one that brought its own sacrifices and suffering. In the medieval world, where women's bodies were often battlegrounds for political gain, Margaret's life and death stand as a testament to spiritual resilience. Tonight, as you close your eyes, think of Margaret not just as a saint, but as a young woman whose life was shaped by forces far beyond her control, forces that demanded devotion, silence, and endurance. Her story reminds us that history is not just about wars and kings, but about the quiet souls who shaped the world in ways often overlooked. So, dim the lights, breathe deeply, and let the story of Saint Margaret of Hungary carry you into the calm depths of the medieval night. Now, let me tell the story of the tragic fate of the Venetian bride. Violante of Aragon was born into a world of silk and shadows. The year was 1353, and the Mediterranean shimmered not just with sunlit waves, but with the glint of sharpened blades hidden behind noble smiles. Her father was Peter IV of Aragon, a monarch known more for his ambition than his affection. Her mother, Eleanor of Sicily, came from a line of rulers who understood that queenship was a burden, not a luxury. So from the moment of her first breath, Violante was not raised to dream. She was raised to wed. She grew up in the courts of Barcelona and Valencia, among perfumed chambers and rustling veils. Her education was carefully curated. She was taught to dance, to read scripture, to speak the flowing courtly tongues of Latin and Occitan, and above all, to obey. By the time she reached the age of 10, her name was already being whispered in marriage negotiations across Europe. She would not have been surprised. She knew, even then, that her body was not really her own. It was a tool of diplomacy. By the mid-1360s, Peter IV had his eye on Italy. Venice and Milan were increasingly influential, and the winds of war and alliance blew hard across the Alps. When the Doge of Venice suggested a match with a powerful Italian prince, Peter saw a golden opportunity. The groom was Galeazzo Visconti, heir to one of the richest and most dangerous dynasties in Lombardy. The Visconti family had clawed their way into power with money, mercenaries, and marriage, and they were eager to link themselves to royalty. Violante, barely 14, was offered as the prize. It was a lavish wedding, more treaty than ceremony. Historians believe the bridal procession stretched for miles through the streets of Venice. Draped in cloth of gold and dripping with borrowed jewels, Violante must have looked every bit the living image of royal prestige. But beneath the finery, she was terrified. She was being handed over to strangers, sent to a land she had never seen, to a man more than a decade older than her, known more for his temper than his tenderness. And so she went, away from Aragon, away from her family, into the brutal, glittering court of Milan. The Visconti palace was not what she had imagined. Yes, there were marble halls and frescoed ceilings, but also spies behind every curtain, and guards who never smiled. Galeazzo Visconti was a man consumed by power. He ruled with an iron will, alternating between bouts of grand generosity and icy cruelty. Violante, so young and delicate, became a jewel in his crown, a trophy bride meant to signal his rise among the European elite. But she was not safe. Court records suggest that her health declined quickly after the wedding, whether it was the stress, the unfamiliar food, or something more sinister. We can't say for sure. Chroniclers describe a melancholy illness, a favorite euphemism of the time for despair, starvation, or poisoning. Her letters, what few remain, are filled with pleas for news from home and subtle lines hinting at loneliness and fear. Pregnancy came early, perhaps too early. The pressure to produce an heir was overwhelming, especially in a family like the Visconti, where lineage and inheritance were guarded like gold. Violante was not yet 15 when she gave birth to a son, Azone. The delivery nearly killed her. The local nuns reported she was left bedridden for weeks, fevered and thin, muttering in her native tongue as her Italian attendants looked on in confusion. The baby survived. But Violante never truly recovered. She lived in Milan for another year, maybe two. Her official death is recorded in 1374. Still a young woman, still technically a princess, but the cause of death remains vague. Some say she died of complications from childbirth. Others speak of a wasting sickness. A few sources, carefully, anonymously, hint at poison. Perhaps it was her husband. Perhaps it was another faction within the Visconti court, seeking to replace her with someone more politically convenient. Or perhaps it was simply the result of years of fear, exile, and bodily strain endured in silence. What makes Violante's story so chilling is not just her death, it's how quickly she was forgotten. Her funeral was formal, but not extravagant. Her body, some say, was buried in a convent tomb without inscription. Her son was raised by nurses and tutors and quickly absorbed into the political machinery of Milan. Her name faded from Aragonese chronicles within a generation. And yet, her story lingers in corners of correspondence. Quiet grief from her sisters, angry scribbles from a frustrated monk who called her marriage a blood price for ambition. In a time when daughters were pawns, Violante was sacrificed not for love, not even for peace, but for power. Today, her name exists mostly in footnotes. She is not the subject of epic poems or chivalric legends. But if you look closely at the politics of late 14th century Italy, at the sudden rise of the Visconti, the shifting alliances of Aragon, the treaties signed in haste and betrayal, you can see the outline of her life etched there, like the faded fresco of a forgotten saint. She was Venetian only by marriage, Aragonese only by birth, and yet belonged nowhere at all. Her life, a brief candle in the grand banquet hall of history, was extinguished with little ceremony, and still it burned just long enough to reshape the map of power. So, as you drift further into sleep tonight, picture her, not in her moment of death, but in her moment of passage. A teenage girl on a ship gliding through the Adriatic, her veil lifting in the salty breeze, sailing toward a destiny carved not in joy, but in necessity. She would never return, but her silence left ripples. She was a bride, a mother, and a political offering. But more than that, she was a warning of what is lost when women are used as currency, and of the quiet tragedies that so often go unrecorded, because they were never meant to be remembered. Thanks for listening. If you're already asleep, great. We've successfully lulled you to sleep. And if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. If you genuinely enjoy these boring stories about history, feel free to subscribe to our channel whenever you're in the mood. Sleep well, and good night.